Okay, there we go. Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start promptly at 1:30, which I guess is now, and we will try to keep this as dynamic and energetic as possible so that you don't keep in the post-lunch lull. Thank you so much for coming to our panel today. We really appreciate seeing you here. Our panel is called Leading Climate Action, Meeting California's Climate Goals and the Needs of Different Communities. My name is Ashley Conrad-Seda. I am no longer a full-time state employee, but serve on the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency Board and had the pleasure of working with this amazing crew of women when I worked in the state. And Rajinder convinced me to come and moderate this panel, and I'm very happy to do it. So we are going to be hearing today from Rajinder Sahota, Nuantara Key, and Saharnaz Mirzazad. All three of them are working to develop and implement integrated climate action. So actions across California that reduce emissions, that improve adaptive capacity, that embed resilience in communities, and that help sequester carbon. And all of these actions have been underway for a very long time in California. California has been an international leader in this space. And we are also, as a state, a model for other subnational jurisdictions. But because of that, because California was a first mover and really led the way in many of these areas, we have a lot of lessons learned. So we'll be hearing today from first Rajinder and then Nuantara, looking at the perspective of mitigation and then adaptation and resilience. And then we'll hear a case study from Saharnaz from the Transformative Climate Communities program. And we'll have an opportunity to hear from each of them first on their perspective on what's been accomplished in the last several years, especially during COVID, when probably you didn't get a chance to hear from them in a public setting like this as often as you might have liked. And then what's coming next? What are these aspirational and ambitious policies? What does California have under the hood for the next phase of climate action as we really need to amplify our benefits and amplify our outcomes? So they'll each get 5 minutes. We'll have a moderated Q&A, and then we'll do a Q&A like all of the panels you've seen today. So please start cataloging your questions and be sure to stay along with us for an hour-long lively discussion. Rajinder. And I should say, I didn't give you any of their titles, but they're all up there, and just know they're all rock stars, and it should just say that after their name.
Thanks, Ashley, and it's very, very flattering for you to say that. I certainly miss you in state government, but glad that you're still a partner on the other side. Because as I'm going to talk about, we need partners on the other side. So what have we been doing in California? Well, we had AB 32 pass back in 2006, and since the very first scoping plan, we pursued not just one policy, but multiple policies. And that's because there is no single one policy to actually get at the climate issues in any economy, in any region. And so we have had a suite of policies. It's incentives, regulations, and carbon pricing. And I will tell you that three-pronged approach that we have in California was endorsed by the original Environmental Justice Advisory Committee that was convened under AB 32. So on that point, we have been aligned with that perspective since the very beginning of the work that we've done at CARB. The differences come into play when we think about carbon pricing. The Environmental Justice Advisory Committee would have preferred something like a carbon tax, but two governors and two legislative bodies have weighed in that the form of carbon pricing that they prefer in California is a carbon market, not a carbon tax. And so today we have incentives for getting new technology out, like clean trucks, clean vehicles, solar roofs, all of those pieces that are important. And then we also have regulations. We regulate directly on landfills, dairies, large industry, energy sources, and we have the cap and trade program and the LCFS program, two market mechanisms at ARB. And these policies are diverse, and they each have an opportunity when it comes to how do you think about that policy, not only achieving your greenhouse gas targets, improving air quality, but also giving some benefits back to some of our marginalized communities, especially our overly burdened communities in the state. And so when we think about this decade, there's one important thing that I think is important, because we see a lot of press about cap and trade, and now more recently about LCFS and factory farms, is that the programs that we have today became twice as stringent on January 1, 2021. There was nothing that changed in the world out there other than everybody that's regulated now has a more stringent target that they're trying to meet, and that we expect to see more reductions in the sectors that we regulate. There's a lot of concern about what the role of these programs were in the last decade. It's a different story. The programs today are very, very different because we have that 40% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030. And when we think about post-2030, the work that we're doing at CARB is really about achieving carbon neutrality no later than 2045. And a lot of that is predicated on, in our modeling scenarios, phasing out fossil fuel combustion anywhere and everywhere we can, where it's cost-effective and technologically feasible in the state of California. And that's a huge statement to make. No other scoping plan to date has made that statement. And we actually started socializing that statement back in 2019 when we did our carbon neutrality report. And I remember going to our chair at the time, Mary Nichols, and saying, can I just say we're going to reduce and replace fossil fuels in the economy? Like, that's the message we should be going for. It got us here. We need to get beyond that. And she's like, yes, we should do it. Very simple words. We all have known this is what it really takes to get there. But we finally were able to start saying the goal is to get out of fossil fuel combustion, which will deliver our GHG targets, and it will absolutely deliver air quality benefits to the communities that have been the worst impacted in the state. Because when you think about distribution centers, ports, trains, freeways, and large stationary sources, energy production, they're located adjacent to some of those vulnerable communities, often communities of color. And so they will reap the largest benefits. And a recent report by one of our sister agencies shows that the largest gains in environmental decreases for exposure to pollution have been in many of these communities that are located in regions where you have heavy-duty traffic or where you have large stationary sources. It also confirmed that there is no evidence that the cap-and-trade program is somehow exacerbating air quality disparities in the state, which has been something that has been hanging out there for quite a while, a shadow over the program. And so it was great to see an independent review come out and make these findings. So to be successful, the answer isn't just going to be to just shut everything down that's fossil fuel combustion. We really need to think about building for the things that we need. So building renewable utility scale solar and wind and offshore wind, and building transmission and distribution to move that energy to the places that need it the most and the places that are only reliant on fossil fuel today. And there's a tension here. There's no time left, according to the IPCC and the latest science. We need to repurpose, and the governor has made this clear in one of his executive orders, we need to repurpose the existing assets, the existing energy production distribution, to move and produce new clean energy, but that we also need to build new things. And California, those of you that live here or work here, you know how hard it is to actually build things in California and get things permitted. And you look at laws like the environmental protection laws and the permitting laws, and they're meant to protect the environment. And they're meant to be a thoughtful, deliberative process. And now that thoughtful, deliberative process it translates into very slow build out of the things we need. And so you're looking at 6 years to get a CCS plant built in California right now. And we're actually talking to one of the project proponents in the Valley. And so all of these things are coming to a head in that communities that have been located next to some of these energy production sources don't want them repurposed. And then you have the need to build new things, and communities that have an amazing view of the bay or an amazing view of the valley don't want to see solar panels out there. And the question is, well, where is it going to happen? If you don't actually let those things happen, status quo is going to persist. And status quo is combustion fuels. The reality we have today will persist unless we can get past this. And the scale is unprecedented when we think about the modeling results for clean energy and clean assets to be built out there. And government is not going to be able to do it on its own. The price tag is enormous on this transition, and it needs to happen over the next decade. And so the public-private partnerships are going to be key here, which means policymakers like us need to send the signals that are going to make investors want to actually invest in the things that are important to the public, important to public safety, public health, and the environment. And that's, again, where programs like the Cap-and-Trade Program, the Low Carbon Fuel Standard come in. They send those strong signals. Not only can we mandate action, which has its own cost, but we can attract dollars from companies and areas that we don't mandate, but making sure those strong market and policy signals are there to get that action to actually happen for the state of California. And I think there has to be a shift when we think about investment, private investment, and even public investment in California. It has to be benefits beyond carbon. And so it's not just about building a facility that takes a gas plant offline. It's about building a facility where the project proponent, or whether it's state funding for an incentive program, we're investing in that community. We're thinking about internships, relationships with local colleges to help uplift the people that live in these regions, to actually make a generational shift in what is actually happening in the lives of people that have been located in these communities and may continue to live in these communities or relocate to these communities. And so as we're all moving forward in state government and in even the private sector, I think it's important to think about, what can I do to show the community I'm not just here to have this extractive relationship where I'm going to do this and I'm going to pull carbon and I'm going to get some money and somebody else is going to pay for it, but really, what else can I do to help on this broader social concern, which is how do you uplift people? And that is going to be really important, because we know, based on some information coming out of Rhodium and UC Santa Barbara, who is doing this work related to an update to the social cost of carbon values, that some of our communities are going to be hit the hardest, and they're the least resilient to impacts of climate change. And so we have to invest in those communities, not only because we're going to have to build and we need to repurpose assets that may exist there, but also because they're going to suffer the most from climate damages. And it's going to show up in the economics about the damages. And all of those damages aren't going to be isolated to one community. Those are a social cost. There's a social cost associated with not investing back into the communities beyond carbon. And so there is a path forward here. It's a period of transition, and I think it's just going to take some time for us to figure out how do we recalibrate to make sure that we're thinking about benefits beyond carbon, but knowing we have to do it quickly and having the right people at the table. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. Oh, I'm going to make one more point. Cap and trade is bringing in billions of dollars, $19 billion to date, and by state statute, over 50% of that has to go back to benefit the communities. And so there is a direct benefit from that market program that is helping in the uplifting of communities that have been overly burdened. Thank
Awesome.
you.
No, thank you, Rajinder. That's great. And yes, we should all be really, really proud of California climate investments and the impacts they've had on the ground. And hopefully, if you travel around California, you see signage as well to show where your cap and trade dollars are contributing back to the state's benefits. So thank you. We're moving to New Antara next. And actually, it's a really nice lead-in, because we now have to figure out, how do we know that we're actually hitting those targets? And New Antara can tell us all about a new report that came out this week that will help us understand just that.
Great. Thank you all. So as mentioned, I'm New Antara Key. I'm Deputy Director for Climate Resilience in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And for those of you who may not know about our office, we are the state's planning entity and work a lot with local governments around meeting state planning law, but also implementing many of the things that Rajinder just mentioned as well. We also play an important role in state government as being the hub for climate resilience and adaptation policy and alignment, again, importantly, across state government, but also with our partners on the ground who are actually implementing adaptation measures across the state. So just a little bit of context in terms of where we are, as some people may not be familiar with our office. As Rajinder mentioned, and I don't need to tell you all, that the window of opportunity for us to take action and to reduce the impacts of climate is very quickly closing here. I was recently on a briefing in advance of one of the IPCC reports that came out in March, and actually one of the authors mentioned and said, this is the last warning. We weren't coming out with another report in time before the window closes. So next time we come to you, it's either going to be success or it's too late. And that was very striking for me, having worked in this space for a long time, but really having that message very clear. And I think one of the things that in California we've really been working on over these especially the last 5-6 years, is continuing to drive globally ambitious emissions reduction, and policies demonstrating implementation on the ground, but also really building out an approach that recognizes while we're reducing emissions, we also have to be adapting, because stationarity is gone, we are in a new world, and we are in a new climate, and we have to be implementing both adaptation and mitigation measures together going back again to one of Rajinder's points of multi-benefit and really looking at the investments we're making need to be driving on this integrated climate agenda. So when I was reflecting on this first question of, what did we do during COVID on climate, since we all haven't seen each other in a long time, I was reflecting on two things, actually, and kind of reflecting from the pandemic. I think some of the learnings that we have made in managing still actively the pandemic. The first is that, change happened overnight, and change happened so quickly, both in terms of the devastating impacts of COVID, especially on communities most vulnerable and with the least capacity to manage, that impact. It also, affected us in the state. I reflect back, and we had just released the proposed budget, and we had in 2020, and we're looking at about a $12 billion surplus, and within a matter of weeks, we were looking at a $54 billion deficit. And that kind of whiplash and the just accelerated rapid change, I think, for me, as I reflect on it, I think is the new normal that we as practitioners need to get used to, is that we have to be adaptable in our work, and we have to be really flexible in addressing the rapidly changing context that we're all in. Second reflection on this point was also just even internally, I keep telling my staff, things will calm down. It's not usually this hectic. It's not usually this busy or chaotic. And none of them believe me, and I don't believe myself either. So I also think, we need to figure out how to balance these many competing priorities, but still urgently implement and make progress that is needed. So what did we do over the last couple years? I think there are three priorities for us as we're looking at adaptation and resilience. And the first is really driving alignment. And adaptation and resilience, as same as mitigation, requires partnership, and it requires breaking down silos in how we are doing our work in order to really address the challenges that we're facing. We also need to focus on building local capacity. Again, for our local government partners, but also within community, the capacity to really understand and drive solutions. And then third, and importantly, is providing actionable tools and resources so that communities are equipped with the information that we all need to be able to manage, the future that will look very different from our past. So on the first point around driving alignment across state government, and as you mentioned, Ashley, we just this week, on Monday, actually released the update to the state's climate adaptation strategy. And there are some really, I think, important shifts that this update reflects that we're very excited about. The first is, rather than just inventorying a bunch of actions that state agencies are taking on adaptation, we really wanted to chart out a set of key priorities. And for those of you who work in the adaptation space and know, the effort to kind of track our progress over time has been a very rapidly evolving field. Unlike in the climate mitigation space, there isn't one metric or, one way to kind of roll things up into one quantifiable metric to track our progress. So what we did is we outlined 6 priorities that we then use to say, okay, state agencies, how is your work contributing to this resilient outcome, whether that's protecting vulnerable communities or strengthening vulnerable communities, driving on nature-based solutions, building a resilient economy, et cetera. And then the second really important piece was actually designing and developing resilience metrics so we could track our progress over time and also increase our own accountability of how we are driving success in adaptation and resilience. So under each of those priorities are a series of goals and actions, and every single action in the strategy has a success metric. And what is very exciting for those of us who work in this space is there's also a number of different state agencies that are all listed and have all had to work together to figure out how their work is contributing to that metric and contributing to those goals and priorities. So really trying to advance kind of the field of practice in providing more guidance, but also, again, that accountability. The third thing, which was also exciting about the strategy, is that rather than releasing it, given the kind of urgency of action and also how quickly things are changing, we have shifted away from a long PDF report, which the state is very good at producing, but actually presented it as a dynamic website that we will be able to update over time and update in real time as additional actions and plans are coming online. So that's one. Happy to dig in more on the strategy as we go. In terms of building local and regional capacity, and I'll just touch on this quickly and then happy to hand it to my colleague Saharnaz here. One of the things that also came through in this last year was significant and historic investment in climate resilience through the state budget. The 2021 budget included a record investment of $3.7 billion towards a climate resilience budget. And within that, nearly $1 billion, $819 million, specifically for community resilience. And this was a big advancement for us and a big shift because it was really demonstrating that part of building resilience is not just, designing infrastructure for new climate conditions, which is critical and part of it, but it also is making direct investments in communities to build capacity and recognizing that social resilience is just as critical as other dimensions of resilience because we, in California and everywhere, we will not be resilient if we're leaving communities behind. And then the third, which is also near and dear to my heart, is continued investment in actionable climate science. And so one of the things that was a major milestone for us in 2020 was the codification of California's climate change assessments and securing significant funding last year for California's fifth assessment, which again is critical in making sure that we have data that is forward-looking in terms of downscaled climate projection to inform all of the state's investment and planning decisions moving forward. So I will stop there. I'm happy to share more detail as we go, but
Great. Thank you so much. And we'll turn to Saharnaz now to talk about what this looks like in action. So if any of you have ever been to Fresno or you've been to all over LA, lots of different neighborhoods in LA, you may have seen the benefits of one of these programs that Saharnaz leads for us, and she'll tell us all about it. So you can really visualize how our action has actually led to community and individual benefits around the state.
Thank you so much, Ashley. My name is Saharnaz Mirzazad. I'm Deputy Director of the Community Investment and Planning at California Strategic Growth Council.
And actually, if folks in the room could not use that door to leave, that would be great because it's really, really loud. So just go out the back. Thank you.
Is it better now? Okay. And similar to New Tara, I feel the urgency to talk about California Strategic Growth Council a little bit. I know that many of you are not from California, so just like introducing what type of agency we are is important here. We are a very small entity. We were only established in 2008 by statute, and we have 7 cabinet members, 8 cabinet members, 7 of them secretaries of the different agencies that sit on our council, and 3 public members that are appointed by the governor, assembly, and senate that govern the Strategic Growth Council. I always think that our small organization is kind of a tugboat in front of a big bureaucracy that is charged with piloting anything that is coming from different agencies to see if it works, and if it works, how it can be implemented in other agencies. So we do interagency coordination and work between these different agencies and like how things will look like actually in action on the ground. We have been beneficiary of the California Climate Investments Fund. We have multiple programs that are funded through the cap and trade. Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program is the one that receives 20% of the auction proceeds every round, and we have Transformative Climate Communities Program that I'll expand on it, and the Sustainable Agricultural Conservation Land Conservation, which is another program that's funded through the CCI program. We have other programs within the SGC that are not necessarily funded by cap and trade dollars, but are important. We don't only focus on the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, but we also fund programs that focuses on building social infrastructure along with the physical infrastructure. We provide technical assistance to different communities, to sister agencies, and also we spend our dollars to make sure that we build capacity on the ground. to make sure that the frontline communities actually have the ability to apply for the state funds and be accessible for everyone in the California. So with that, I would like to focus a little bit on one of our programs, which is Transformative Climate Communities program that has been in work since 2018. And a little bit talk about the COVID and lessons learned during that time and how we're using that in future and why we think that it's important to expand on this model and use it in hopefully in other state and federal programs as well. Transformative Climate Communities program was established through a statute, and we have 8 communities in the pipeline right now that have access to the funds. It's a neighborhood level investment. It's large investments that looks into integrated infrastructure on the ground. Basically, anything that's funded through the California Climate Investment Fund is accessible through Transformative Climate Communities program. So communities go through a visioning process, which is very locally led process. We hold the communities accountable to that. And then they come up with a concept that they would like to see in their communities that will make their communities more resilient against the impact of climate change. These infrastructure range from green infrastructure to affordable housing to bike paths, anything that will reduce greenhouse gas emission and also provide some benefits to the community. The beauty of the program is that it's not only funds this physical infrastructure, but it requires the applicants to look to the impact of the climate change in long term and see how these impacts will be considered in the new infrastructure that we're investing in. And along with that, we also require them to have a long-term community engagement plan, displacement avoidance plan, and also workforce development plan to make sure that the community that we are investing in will benefit from it eventually. One of our largest investments has been in Fresno, $65 million investment. And as Ashley mentioned, it has been one of the areas that has been really challenging for us as a state government to look into how we are operationalizing the resilient concept there. We didn't start from a very easy place. As you know, this is one of the part of the California that has a lot of climate challenges, air pollution challenges, and also not a lot of excitement around talking about climate change. So the starting point was for us going through this process with the community who are in the front line of the impact, but also not being able to talk about it to begin with. It took us a couple years, and during the COVID, what was very, very interesting to watch is that the investment that we made there made it obvious that we need to have this type of investment and community-based approach all along the way. Otherwise, we will lose. So another example is a Watts community neighborhood that we invested in Los Angeles. And one of the first things that happened, we had a walk to school program that funded through the TCC program. They quickly turned to change that program to walk food from the school to the community members that couldn't go to school anymore, and they have locked in their homes. So the benefits were obvious from the beginning that how building this basic infrastructure in these communities can support being more resilient and also a long-term impact that come from those. And the other thing that I would like to, when I was reflecting on the question, is what we have done in the last couple of years. I think as an state and being in the agency that's kind of a little bit more nimble compared to the other agencies, we were able to quickly look into our own books and our own grant agreements, our contracts, where we are falling short, where we are providing unnecessary limitations that we are limiting access to our dollars and not providing flexibility for people to actually be able to operate in a way that serves their communities. There were some very, very simple things that we were able to change that made a huge impact in access to our dollars and provide that flexibility that should have been there from the beginning. So checking on ourselves as a government and turning the point of what is our responsibility as a government to our people, to our community, was an important realization during the COVID. Very, very simple thing, and I always joke about this, when we got the feedback in the first round of the TCC awards that your insurance requirement in your grant agreement is too high, and most of the people that work in the community and CBOs, they basically cannot afford even to be part of this. And we had to dig into our own books, like where this is coming from. And it was like not a grant agreement requirement, it was a kind of a copy-paste from a contracting manual for like big projects and all of that I think that probably nobody really paid attention to it in the past. It was a very small fix, no legal challenge, nothing. But it kind of like opened it up for many of like one or two small business, like small nonprofits, CBOs on the ground to be part of this whole huge thing that we're providing to them. And I'm coming from planning background, contracting and all of that. It's not something that I did in the past, but I'm totally blown away how much impact these small things in the state bureaucracy can have on communities, and how just listening to them, just learning from them, and having this door open and this feedback loop is important for us. So again, I think we are lucky to be in California. We are lucky to have the access to resources to these climate investment funds, have this whole resources that's provided to us. But to operationalize it, we need to start from bottom up, empower the people to be at the table, and we are doing that in all stages of this whole award making and implementation. When we are asking the community to be a part of the visioning process, we are also asking them to be in the grant implementation phase by writing their names in the grant agreement and holding them accountable that this will be a process that's inclusive throughout the entire stage of the implementation. We want to make sure that these people will not be displaced as a result of our dollars. We hold them accountable to displacement avoidance plan that they put forward. We check on them. We provide implementation technical assistance if they fall short. One of the things that we faced in Fresno was like they literally said, like, we don't have any displacement. That was the statement. Fresno doesn't have a displacement issue in Southwest Fresno. That is where the starting point was. Although it has one of the highest burden of the renter to income in entire California. We had to go through many hoops with the local folks, with CBOs, with the city, to come up with a plan. Let's look at it. Let's look at it from the data point. We will give you the money to hire a consultant to do it. They hired a consultant, they went through it, and this has been one of the most comprehensive displacement avoidance plans in California now. It hasn't been adopted by the council. It has so much into it and reveals many of the things that it was like denied from the beginning. That kind of like shows like, yes, we have to have this type of studies, support them if we want to get to a place that these people will be beneficiary of our dollars. So I don't know how much time I have, but I can speak about this for a real long time, but happy to answer any questions later about it.
Well, thanks to all three of you for starting us off. I have a lot of follow-up questions, but I'm going to go to the ones that I prompted for you so I don't throw anything really new at you just yet. But one of them, I think, comes from this discussion over the lessons learned in California, right? So, Saharnaz, you're talking about starting from the bottom up, really engaging locals and communities. Rajinder's talking about market-based mechanisms and a lot of other things that actually require massive amounts of government intervention and buy-in. We're talking about adaptation and resilience that really sort of crosses all of those different tools and techniques. So, and we're also talking about, we have $19 billion from one fund alone to make these changes. For other jurisdictions around the world who don't have access to an enormous amount of capital, both personal and financial, because we have a huge climate team in California, how can they take some of the lessons learned and actually start chipping away at their own climate plans and their own climate actions in a way that's really authentic and that produces these measurable benefits for social benefits and community benefits and environmental benefits? What are some ways that others can jump in without the abundance that we have here?
One quick thing is, and this has been something we've been working on in California as well, is I don't think you have to have a standalone pot of funding that is designated your climate fund, and then there's all the other investments you're making. We are missing an opportunity every day. As public institutions, we are making investments in communities every single day through every dollar we spend, and we are missing opportunities to really meet our goals if we're not thinking about those dollars as ways to implement emissions reductions, ways to build resilience, ways to support communities. And so I think part of it is, yes, we have the luxury of, an amazing system and, all of these resources. But if you don't have a framework and you don't understand what the goals are that you're working towards, you are going to, we're all going to miss those opportunities. So I would say it's helpful to have a fund. And I realize the position I'm saying this from, but, there are other ways to think about these investments as well.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in and say that one of the things that I always notice about California relative to other jurisdictions, whether they're subnational or national, is the long, unwavering commitment by our legislative body and by our governors that climate legislation and action on climate and investments back in the communities are going to be part of California's story. And so that sustained commitment, almost going to 20 years in the next 2 or 3 years, has been a strong signal that has attracted that private investment. And I think there's a story here that, you can see the corollary at the national level. When the waiver was taken away under the previous administration, automakers stopped doing anything, and then they fought us at ARB, and in California, we came back, and now everybody wants to help and be part of the solution again. Well, that's time lost. But in California, because we've had this unwavering, long-standing, steady commitment to action on climate, the message is clear. We're headed in a certain direction. We're moving away from fossil fuels. And so when it comes to research, development and deployment of clean technology, it's happening because people see that we want it to happen, and we've not changed that position. And so there's a lesson here for other government officials, is that if you really want to see and attract that money, that private investment, here's what it takes, and here's how long it's taken to get there. And I'm going to use an example of the low carbon fuel standard. When that program was first put on the books, it was vehemently fought by the oil industry in California. It's meant to diversify the fuel mix. It's meant to, carve away from the market position of fossil fuels in the transportation sector. Well, we didn't let go of it. The previous governors didn't let go of it. The current governor has not let go of it, and it's persisted. And it's not in statute. It's an early action measure at ARB, and we've always defended that program and made sure that we could successfully implement the program. Now it's 2021 and 2020 when the COVID hits, and all of the demand for fossil fuels goes down because of the shelter in place. Well, the refiners in California see no place to market their fuels. Now they're thinking, what's my future opportunity? CARB just kicked off a process to do a scoping plan. They're talking about phasing out fossil fuels in the state of California. What am I going to do? It sent the signal to start repurposing those existing assets to make sustainable aviation fuel and to make renewable diesel, which are all going to cut air quality emissions and GHG emissions. And so there is a real-world example about how sustained signals matter, especially from government officials and agencies.
I think when I look into our portfolio of our investment, in many cases, the dollar that you invest, the amount of it is not that important of the intentionality of the investment. In every single investment that we have made so far, we have been able to bring 3 times more of that money in the leverage funding from other resources. The most important thing is that where our dollars goes far. If you don't have a lot of access to a lot of dollars, look into where your dollars can make a transformation, where that can be leveraged to bring other resources. That's how I would encourage you to look into your portfolio if you don't have access to dollars the way that we have in California. And definitely, I echo what Nintara mentioned, that we make those investments. It's just looking into pipeline of the projects that you have, where you can put dollars into the resilience and reducing carbon. We invest in our transportation no matter what. Does that need to go to highways, or can we look into that differently? We make investment in housing anyway. Does it have to be in a greenfield, or can we look into infill development? So those are very, very simple questions, but if we kind of turn the page to look from the other side, that investment in infrastructure, in any way of it, can be resilient and sustainable and low carbon, then we are talking about something else. And if we have limited dollars, where our dollars can go far and bring other dollars in to make a change in communities.
Great, thank you. Just looking at time and thinking about potentially questions in the audience, I think we'll turn to a few audience questions, and then I have a few more if we need to. Is there anyone out there who's ready to ask? John, go ahead.
Yeah, I have one
You asked a question I can't answer. Sorry. I am going to have to go back to my colleagues who lead that up and find out. But, yeah.
That was a good question. We'll find out. And John mentioned CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. In California, you're blessed with both complying oftentimes with NEPA and with CEQA. And so as we mentioned, or as you've heard, there are a lot of different pieces that need to be unraveled or dealt with every time we introduce innovation in California. And so far, we've met that challenge, but there's clearly going to be more to come. Any other questions out there? Otherwise, I'll ask another. Amber, yeah.
Thanks. So climate policy doesn't exist in just even one agency. We've got representatives from many of the agencies here. There's so many more, the Energy Commission, the Public Utilities Commission, Cal Recycle, Water Board, all of us are in this space. And in doing the scoping plan, what we're realizing is there is one theme that cuts across all of the agencies right now, and that is building the things we need. When we talk about diversion from landfills, it's taking that organic waste and what do you do with it? Well, you can expand wastewater facilities to take that additional diversion, or you can build composting facilities. All of those are facing challenges at the local level, and they are not even related to CARB, right? And here we're talking about the SB 100, the zero carbon electricity that we did with the Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Commission, and we're talking about unprecedented build-out of renewables and even renewable hydrogen hubs, all of these pieces to get away from fossil fuels. And what we're seeing is local ordinances not allowing utility-scale solar to happen anymore. No access to transmission access to, if you're a community and you have a gas plant, this is a real example because we keep hearing about it, and you want to turn that gas plant off, if I can't help you get transmission to the larger grid with renewables, reliability means you have to keep that gas plant on. And it's not going to be socially acceptable for us to just turn off that gas plant without access to the broader grid. So there's all these things that are coming up, and it's all coming back to, you know, you can clean up what we have as much as you want incrementally to get to the 2020 target, which California did 4 years ahead of schedule. And then you can think about what it takes for that deeper reduction of 40% and then that 80% that's sitting out there in 2050, et cetera. But it's going to mean that we're intentionally saying we no longer want to keep these things online. We want to bring these new things. And so socially, politically, it's not going to be okay to turn off energy in the state of California. That's just simply not an answer that's exportable or even practical or is going to be socially acceptable. And so if we can't build those new things, then we're not going to be able to get off of the old things. And I know that there's been efforts with some of the folks at the legislature and some of the advocates, and they talk about, you know, streamlining, and we're always like, let's caveat that streamlining, making sure you still keep the public health and environmental protections, but what does it look like to streamline the process? And at one point we started joking, I said, actually, the bill should just be called Build Back Here and Protect People. Like, that's what the bill should be, Build Back Here and Protect People. Like, you're done. But that is the theme that's emerging, is we're not going to be able to incrementally clean up the energy sources upstream. You actually need new energy sources at this point.
Other questions? Great, go ahead.
So the legislature took that into consideration when they had AB 398, which talked about adding a price ceiling into the cap and trade program specifically. And they had a list of factors that we should consider. And we went through, I think, a 1.5-year public process to come up with what the price ceiling should reflect. And so that's, you know, the price ceiling persists, it's going to stay in the program, and that's where we're at right now. Now, the one thing I've learned regulating the cap and trade program and working on it is no price at any point is ever the right price. It's either always too low or too high, and it depends on who you ask, right? There are people that wanted $1,000 a ton as the price ceiling in the program when we were doing the price ceiling workshops. And then there were people that wanted a flat, like $40 or $50 the entire decade. which means when you have those extremes, then you get to come in and be like, well, let's look at the factors, let's think about what this is, and then our board adopted it. But I think right now what we're really talking about is the program we have for cap and trade just came into force about a year and a half ago, right? January 1, 2021. Have we seen price spikes? Have we seen the program act in a way that causes consumer shocks or anything like that? We haven't. What we've seen are exogenous impacts from things like the war that's going on, inflation, other global factors. And I know it's easy to say California is really expensive because they have all these progressive environmental policies, but when you really start to pull back the layers, it's a more deeper story, right? It's a surcharge that you can't explain at the price at the pump. It's other factors like wildfire, resilience in the grid, which is completely unrelated to the climate policies. And so I think people have to be willing to get into those details, and I think our legislative body and our governor's office, they're fully aware of all of these pieces and what's contributing to what. But the story about high prices, it's easy to pick up and just point to a program and say the program's broken or you need to fix it.
Other questions? Yes.
So I think that's a great question given where we're at in the scoping plan process at the Air Board, and that is looking out to carbon neutrality no later than 2045. And what we're seeing is everybody wants to electrify transportation, everybody wants to electrify buildings, electrify the ports, locomotives, any other sector, small industry, electrify it. And we, CARB, have a lot of these regulations. And I asked some of the divisions, have you guys ever taken a step back and added up how much electricity you're asking for from the overall grid? And I'm like, and most of them don't because they think about it in their siloed sector and what they regulate. Well, in the scoping plan, my team gets to do that. We get to take a step back and think about, okay, here's all the technology and energy we want to deploy. What does that mean for the energy supply? It's very clear right now that the build-out is unprecedented if we only want to rely on electrification. And we want it to be available everywhere at the same time. That's not realistic. And so you have to not take any tools off the table right now. We are in a period of transition. We need to think about how to manage that transition. And then maybe in the future you can say, now we've reached that massive build out, it's resilient, we can start pulling back on some of these other things. But now is not the time to take any tools off the table. That's exactly right.
But I will add that I feel like 20 years ago we were saying that all of the stuff that we're talking about today wasn't possible. So I think we have to keep dreaming because we know in 20 years we'll look at this question and say, look, we did it, right? So I think part of the spirit of working on climate work is that you have to be innovative every single day and you have to have massive optimism to think that you can actually change the trends that we are so used to. I want to ask another question just to make sure we hear a little bit more about SGC and OPR as well. And that's about accountability and how you enforce accountability when you're thinking about you were talking about anti-displacement, Saharnaz, and these are, some of the policies that are coming out in adaptation and resilience, we do not know how to implement. And the metrics that you're talking about, we're not quite sure how to measure them. So how do you actually ensure that these things are happening? And then what type of accountability can you put in place to keep moving us forward really progressively?
Thank you. So As I mentioned, we look into accountability in different stages. One is when we're actually awarding the grants, the communities. We have very hands-on relationship with these communities to make sure that the true community engagement has happened. But that's not enough. The next step is like, if you have these community members, this nonprofit organization, the CBOs that have been involved, we want you to have an MOU together, how you will be involved in future in the implementation. And that MOU is part of our agreement if they want to access our dollars. So we hold them accountable to make sure that the people that are on the ground are part of the implementation phase. We have a stakeholder structure in place. They meet quarterly, they meet monthly. Any changes to the grant agreement, any impact on the ground should be reported back. They are part of the decision-making process. The community members, small businesses have a seat there. So it's kind of like a collaboration within the community that is actually formalized through our grant agreements, that we hold them accountable to that. But we also know that when you have like a growing number of the communities, it's really challenging to make sure that we deliver the same level of the service. One of the things that we had from the beginning, the vision that we have to measure the impact of our investment and also the processes that we put in place. We partnered with the academic institutions in different communities, and 5% of our grant agreements is set aside for that effort. They are a third-party contractor on our behalf. They do the evaluation on an ongoing basis. They report back to us. They report back to CARB, and we kind of package that report back to legislators to make sure that us as an state delivering and the communities that have requested our dollars and have received our dollars are also delivering on the metrics that we put in place. We have a basic report that was developed by UCLA Luskin Center, which is like indicators that we are tracking across all these investments. And every investment that we make is also compared to a control site nearby. So things that we are seeing in the community are really happening as a result of our investment, or there are other factors that are playing there. So they're kind of we are also having a very scientific approach to that to make sure that we are kind of delivering on the promises of our program from the beginning to the end. So there are a lot that's playing here. We are learning. These third-party evaluators also provide us with a process impact report that if us as an state are coming short in some places, they let us know. They provide suggestions how we can improve our work on an annual basis, and we kind of factor that in the next guidelines and also our grant agreements and all of that is reflected as a result of it.
Great. And then on the adaptation side, I mentioned the update to the state adaptation strategy. I think a couple things that we worked through over the last couple years is, I mentioned, trying to move away from this idea where on the adaptation space you'd have a clear analog to the mitigation side where you'd have one single metric, and just recognizing that is not how adaptation works, especially when you're working across so many sectors and issue areas. So some work to get our stakeholders and our partners on board that it's going to be a dynamic way to actually track our progress. But in terms of kind of the internal accountability, it was also working with our state partners to understand what is the work that you are doing and finding a way that works to track progress in many different ways. So some of the metrics, when you look at the state adaptation strategy, they are very qualitative, and they are going to be something that is not easily quantifiable in terms of numbers of acres or tons emissions reductions, but they are still really important. And one of the areas where I think we have additional work to kind of focus on is actually how do we track and measure adaptive capacity within community. And I think that's an area where we want to continue pushing ourselves to understand what does that look like in community, and how do we actually make sure that the investments we're making are helping to build that adaptive capacity. Again, going back to what I mentioned before, as equally as important as building adaptation metrics into our infrastructure and our natural systems.
More questions out in the audience? Great.
So this is probably for Rajinder, but everybody, I guess. I just want to lay out sort of the way I see the timeline, and maybe you can sort of help educate me if I'm wrong. So we're doing the scoping plan. discussion on policy changes or market changes or whatever. Is that fair?
Close.
Okay.
You almost got it, Andre. Almost got it. So the scoping plan will be public in early May. It goes to our board in June. And we know that the legislative members are very active in thinking about climate policy and putting out what they think is the right path for California. So we fully expect to get legislative direction through the summer, which will have to be fed back into a scoping plan because we have to reflect legislative direction, right? When we go to the board in June, our board may ask for changes to what we, as the staff, say, this is the path that we think is the right path. What do you think, board? There'll be a public discussion, and then over the summer we'll have some iterations. And then at some point, probably around September, October, we come out with a final scoping plan. That goes to the board at the end of the year for a final vote. Now, sometime in midsummer, we will also be workshopping the final modeling on the scoping plan, right? And that modeling is really what kicks into and feeds the regs that we have. And so you've got what kind of fuels do we need in the transportation sector? How quickly do we need to decarbonize the energy sector? All of these. That means that the PUC, ARB, the CEC, we're all looking at our programs and thinking, if we're in an active process, do we start to build in what the scoping plan says we need to do, or do we think about waiting until the end of the scoping plan to then start a new process? Now, with CARBs programs, especially with LCFS and cap and trade, they're really big dollar programs. And so we want to have a thorough public process on those. We will do informal workshops starting this summer that will feed into a formal rulemaking process in 2023.
Okay, so not too far off. Great. Thank you.
Erica, did you have a question?
Yeah, definitely. One, I think, just going back to kind of the enabling statute that created our adaptation program in our office, that is a main priority and driver and cross-cutting priority, which is making sure that our adaptation actions are driving on equitable outcomes, fully recognizing that, we have many different statutory terms and, definitions, disadvantaged, under-resourced, communities that have not had the same access to resources, decision-making, are impacted by, climate worse than other communities that have more capacity and opportunity. And so definitely, that is an underpinning kind of priority to the work that we do in looking at adaptation. I think in terms of your question of, how are we targeting investments to respond to, especially communities that are most vulnerable to the impacts, I think there are a couple of things that we are working on. One, specifically in our office, we're actually working to pull together a platform that will bring together the information that we need to actually be able to inform investments to get just at that. So for those of you who are familiar with Cal EnviroScreen, it's a little bit of an analog to that, but really thinking about climate risk, recognizing that, flooding can impact a community. You can have the same level of flooding everywhere. That doesn't mean every community member or every homeowner is impacted in the same way. And so going back to this point of kind of adaptive capacity, that is actually one of the really critical things that we need to get a better handle on, so we understand why can some people, is it access to insurance? Yes, but are there other things as well that need to be brought into these, our understanding, so that then we as the state and also our local partners, when we're making investments, we're targeting them to overcome these underlying kind of structural dynamics or factors that are driving vulnerability.
Thanks. Okay, I want to give each of you just a final 30 seconds if you have anything that you want to talk about or springboard from before we close up. If there's anything else you want the folks in the audience to know about California or look up when they leave here and engage with.
I would say listen to your communities. They're the best solutions out there. They're much more creative and forward-thinking than you might realize. Always look for solutions in the local level.
Yeah, I would say, given the urgency of action that we all need to take, is not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and that we need to implement and we need to learn from that and continue to, learn as we go, but we really need to take action.
And I would just say that California has been a leader on climate policies and implementation. We've seen many successes, and so we can be an example for exportable programs to other national and subnational regions. And we've gone through the pains of growing and adjusting along the way. And so we are a toolkit. California is a toolkit for climate policies. Pick and choose what you want, but please pick something.
That's a perfect closing remark, because California has picked everything. So now we just want you all to pick something, please, and take it back to your home institutions and organizations and companies and get going. So thank you so much for being here today. Thanks for our amazing panel, and we will see you throughout the day.